So you can sit in silence all you want, but if you don't have a way of connecting with the other part of yourself, so you're not complete without us. It's not like diversity is cute and you just like all the different colors because it's so pretty. Okay. It's that there is that which you won't know. You don't have a history if you don't know my history. So there's just that of God you will never know without me, right? And there's that of God I'm not gonna know without you.
Thee Quaker Podcast.
Story, spirit, sound.
I'm Georgia Sparling.
And I'm Jon Watts.
And we want to welcome you to episode 1 of season 2.
Yeah, it's been a few months since we've been in your feed. Georgia, how's it been going?
It's been great. It's been super busy. We've got a lot of stories to share this season. And so that's meant I've been hitting the ground running, doing lots of interviews for our upcoming episodes.
So what can our listeners expect in season 2?
Yeah, well, if you take a look at our new logo, you'll get a hint at one of the stories that we're working on this season, which is a profile on Bayard Rustin. He was a civil rights leader and an organizer, and his name has come up a lot lately. Like I even heard it on Jeopardy the other day. So we really want to explore the role of his Quaker faith in the monumental work that he did. And we also want to take a broader look at the civil rights movement and the role that Quakers played in it. We're going to look at the impact of some friends whose names probably aren't going to be on Jeopardy. We're introducing a new segment this year, too. We'll tell you more about that after the credits. And we're going to dive into some of the frequently asked questions about Quakers. Jon, do you want to say more about that one?
Oh, yeah. Well, so one of the things I learned in my time running a Quaker YouTube channel is that if you want to know what people are wondering about you, figure out what they are Googling. Of course, you have to filter out all of the oats and the Amish stuff.
Yeah, the Quaker oats jokes, they never go away.
It's very visible. But there are actually some really interesting questions in there when you dig down. One of the most Googled questions about us is, what do Quakers believe? That's a tough one. Do Quakers drink alcohol? That's an interesting one. Why are Quakers pacifists? Things like that. And we're excited that this medium, our 30-minute weekly podcast, is an opportunity to go a little deeper than one might normally get in a Google search.
Yeah, those are all going to be really great to dig into. But let's talk about today's episode, which brings up some big topics in Western Quakerism today, like how do you make space for minorities and marginalized people when you have a mostly white religious community? And what does it look like to create worship spaces that are culturally inclusive? And then what about activism? How can that grow faithfully while taking into account both worship and culture? And we're going to explore these questions today through the story of the Ujima Friends Peace Center in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and also through the story of Ayesha Imani, who is one of its founders.
Oh, great. Yeah, I remember that you spoke with Ayesha the last time you were in Philly, and I've been excited to hear that tape.
Yeah, well, a few minutes in Ayesha's presence, and you know that you're talking to somebody who's really special and thoughtful.
Indeed, yeah. Okay, let's hear it.
I'm Ayesha Imani, and I have been a Quaker for about 40 years.
Ayesha is an educator who is in leadership at 2 African-centered charter schools in Philadelphia. She's also one of the founding members of Ujima Friends Peace Center and Ujima Friends Meeting, which occupy the same space in a corner of North Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It's a community center and a worship center rolled into one. But if you attend worship there, it will be unlike any Quaker worship service you're likely to find in America.
First of all, there's space for our traditions. So when you come to a Ujima worship, it's going to start with the pouring libations. It's going to start with the remembrance of the ancestors and reverence to God, right? Known by many names in different ways. And so you're going to hear some ashe and some amen too.
Ayesha has a lot of examples of how cultural expression is a natural part of their weekly meetings.
This brother came with a staff. It was like, I just thought it was an African staff. Then in the middle of worship, he takes the staff and he starts playing it like a flute. You got to get ready for that at Ujima. You might hear a gospel song, or you might hear a rhythm and blues song. You might hear prayer and laughter and tears, right? But there is like room for expressions of the Spirit, and there's more inclusion of our cultural expressions.
I'm sitting with Ayesha in a large open room at the Ujima Friends Peace Center. Nearby is a circle of chairs for the Ujima Friends worship. There's a djembe and bright wall hangings. It's fitting because the Peace Center began with worship. But first, what does Ujima mean?
Ujima means collective work and responsibility. And it means that we commit to making our brothers and sisters' problems our problems and solving them together. And so that the spirit of Ujima is the spirit of collectivism, of working together, and it's not missionary. It's not, I'm going to solve the problems of other folks. It's that I'm really realizing that their problems are our problems. And so we're going to solve them together.
For Ujima, that means a freedom school for Black children in the summers, giving away groceries to low-income members of the community, hosting an international sewing initiative, and worshiping however they please. Maybe that latter part feels a little bit un-Quaker, or at least untraditional and loud for an unprogrammed Quaker meeting in the States. But before we get into that, let's take a step back and find out how Ayesha even got here.
I've been on quite a spiritual journey in my life, starting out as a evangelical fundamentalist Christian, and then becoming a Muslim. And I think probably the biggest thing was I fell in love with someone who was Jewish. And I still wanted to be Muslim. He still wanted to be Jewish. And we needed to find a place that would give us room to continue to journey.
Ayesha tried Unitarian Universalists, Baha'i, and a few other religious groups before she gave Friends a try. She attended her first unprogrammed silent meeting in the early 1980s and was reminded of a passage in the New Testament book of Acts. In this passage, the apostles sat waiting on God in this upper room. The story in Acts chapter 2 then sees an unleashing of the Holy Spirit on this early Christian church.
And so I walk into this Quaker meeting and there's this silence, but I get the sense that they're waiting because people gathered in the upper room to wait. So I'm like, wait a minute, these people are waiting to hear from God. Like they still think that God can actually talk directly to them. I'm like, okay, I'm down with this. I'm so down with waiting and listening for the voice of God, because I do still believe that God is speaking, that God is moving. And I felt that I was in this continual conversation with God. And the idea that there are these other folk who are waiting to hear from God, that just blew my mind.
Ayesha was kind of in awe of Quaker worship.
Then I noticed how many people were white. And I said, okay, I gotta think about like how this all plays out, because I was not seeking to be away from Black folk. I love my people, and I love building with Black people and growing with Black folk and working on issues of our liberation. And so I wasn't looking to be in an overwhelmingly white community. But I feel like that's where the Spirit of God sent me. And so I've been working it out since then.
Ayesha grew up in Philadelphia in a religious family where her culture and identity were celebrated. Her mother was a member of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Plus, Ayesha was a child of the 60s. Activism for her was as natural as breathing.
I was, participating in protest. I'm also the niece of a Baptist preacher, and there were so many preachers in my family. So I really grew up very early on with this passion for God and the Spirit, and this love for Black people, and this sense of mission around Black people and Black self-determination.
As she became more involved in the Quaker world, she also began to feel the confines of worship among mostly white friends. She recalls this interaction that she had at a meeting many years ago.
Okay, so first of all, I was late, but I sat on the facing bench, and I had like the cutest, this red dress. Oh, I was wearing this dress. It was not wearing me. And I have to say, I looked good in that dress. So I'm on the facing bit with my red shoes, my red high heels, my little slinky red dress, and I'm just in the spirit and I'm happy. And a white man came at the end and said, friend, Quaker women, they don't wear like red to meeting. And I said, Black women do.
Ayesha says the homogeneity of her Quaker meeting also affected her worship. She felt restricted, but also that she was not being true to God's leading in her or to her own cultural expressions of faith.
Why, when I'm sitting in meeting, that I don't say hallelujah? Like, why when the Spirit, like when I'm feeling the Spirit to fall on my knees, why won't I do that? Why, when a gospel song comes to me, why am I not standing up singing that? Like, why? Right? And so for me, it was like, okay, you're a coward, right? You're buying in too much into what these people do. And so I had to then say, I got to find some spaces. And if I can't find them, I have to help create some spaces where I am faithful to the Spirit of God in me and the expressions of that Spirit based on my culture, right? And so, and as I do that, then it does change Quaker culture, because it's as Quaker as when white Quakers are performing Quakerism through their culture, right? And so that's what the Fellowship of Friends of African Descent, and I think that's what Ujima Friends Meeting is about, creating spaces where the Spirit is free. So it's not only about our liberation. I know this sounds bizarre, but it's almost like God has to be liberated because we entrap the Spirit in our cultural expressions, our political perspectives. It's like, look, you can tell me anything, but it has to be this and it has to sound like this, and right? And so if I'm in Quaker meeting, but the only way the Spirit of God can reach me is through speaking Quakerese, like, and whispering it, then I'm building this real little narrow cell for the Spirit to operate in. So I'm about like, let's give the Spirit more space, right? Let's give her room to show up in a different way than she's showing up in a traditional Quaker meeting.
By now, it was around the mid-1980s, a few years since Ayesha had visited her first Quaker meeting, and decades before Ujima was even a thought. But Ayesha had begun to connect with Black Quakers from across Philly, gathering in homes around the city for worship and community. Then those Black Quakers, who called themselves the Fellowship of Friends of African Descent, started to look further afield.
What would it mean if we reached out to Black folks in Quaker meetings all over this country and the world? And so we did that, and we had our first gathering at Pendle Hill,
a retreat and learning center just outside of Philadelphia.
About 100 people came. Some white folks came out of curiosity. And but there were Black people that came from all over this country, and from the Caribbean and places in Africa. And we came together, and that first worship was 3 hours long, because it just there was this liberty of the spirit that was just so awesome. So there was silence and there was laughter, because Black people, we're gonna have jokes too. And there was singing and just praying.
Those gatherings became the foundation out of which Ujima would eventually grow, propelled by national reports of violence against Black men at the hands of police officers.
The weekend of July 4th, 2016, when Anton Sterling, Philippe Castile were murdered by the police that weekend, I just think Black people all over the country just felt like sick, and for some of us, it was like, we got to do something. Like, we have to do something. So what can we do? And so got some friends together over our house and just praying and seeking. And we developed this minute. Quakers will create minutes, a declaration. So we have developed this declaration, this minute on state-sanctioned violence. And as a part of that minute, we talked about things we could do, not just say we're against it, we're against the way Black bodies are in peril. Like we talked about some of what we thought the roots of this violence, and we expanded the definition of violence. It's not just physical violence, right? It's economic violence, it's educational violence. It's all of those things, most of which are rooted in greed from this capitalistic system.
The Fellowship of Friends of African Descent outlined 4 points of action. 1. The creation of a peace force of police and community peacekeepers, all unarmed, to introduce nonviolent responses to conflict. 2. Establish peace centers, safe havens of educational, cultural, and recreational opportunities for young people. 3. Community training for police. And 4. Disarming communities. But what to do first?
Somebody said, let's do the Peace Center first. And so we put our money together and said, let's go, right? So what we didn't do, we didn't ask for permission to come into being. We didn't ask for people to give us money. We're like, okay, let's put some money together. Let's go look for a place and let's open a Peace Center. We had no idea what it was going to turn into. And we said, once we got it, we said, okay, what's the first thing we should do? We should establish worship.
After the break, the Ujima Friends Peace Center launches, and Ayesha asks white Quakers, when are you going to start making reparations?
Hello.
Hey, Becca, it's Jon Watts. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well.
You gave us a donation in June of 2023. Thank you so much for your contribution. And you left us a comment that said that you're a quasi-Quaker who loves good storytelling. So I was wondering if you could tell me about that. How are you, what does that mean to be a quasi-Quaker?
Yes. So my mother was raised Quaker. Her grandfather became Quaker after his experience in the military. And so we grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. She would take the 4 of us kids to meetings. So I was, held as a baby in the Quaker meeting. And then when I moved away and started living in different cities, I would go in the different cities that I went, but I never really started going regularly as an adult until last year when I was living in Nashville. Started going regularly, really got a lot out of it. And then I moved away from Nashville. And I haven't gone to the local meeting where I live now yet, but I have had the podcast to listen to. And so it's helped sort of bridge this transition.
Yeah, thank you. So what was it like to go to Quaker meeting again?
It reminded me a lot of my experiences when I was younger. Just, it's always a different building, but in my experience, there's always a similar kind of energy and calmness that just radiates from these spaces. I think in that first one back, there weren't any messages even given, but I still just felt the sense of like, yes, this is good. This is what a part of me has been searching for and desiring. So in the end of 2022, I stopped drinking. And in January 2023 is when I started going to meeting in Nashville. And I sort of joke that I didn't start going to AA, but I started going to Quaker meeting. And someone there happened to also start sharing messages about their experience in recovery. And so it really was helpful for me during that time where I felt like it was important to have something that was sort of soul satisfying, but uniquely for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What happens for you in that hour of silence?
It oftentimes feels like a circus is happening in my head. But it's the circus that would be happening anyway, and I'm just actually able to let it play and let it run in a space where I feel anchored by the presence of the other people that are there. Quakerism is part of my family story, and as much as people talk about it within my family, I think there's always still this sense of like mystery or intrigue around it. You can talk about it as much as you want, and it still feels like this thing that's different than almost anything else in my life anyway. It's just not quite containable. And so listening to the podcast helps give some depth to these like intangible things that I've always heard and felt, and provide some context.
So I wonder if you have any advice for us in making, season 2 of the podcast.
I mean, not really, just to keep doing what you're doing. When I heard that this podcast would be coming out, I was like, oh man, this is either going to be like really, really good or it's going to struggle. And I mean, that's the case with most podcasts in general. But I was really like hoping and pulling for this one to be in that really good category, and it has exceeded what I was hoping for.
Oh, thank you. If you're like Becca and you're hoping and pulling for this podcast to be the best Quaker podcast it can be, then we could really use your support. The Quaker Podcast is listener supported, and I'm so happy to say that in season 1, we met our financial goal of 65 monthly supporters. Thank you so much. However, we know from the analytics that this show is reaching about 3,500 listeners every month. So if you're one of those 3,435 folks who are listening but haven't quite made it yet to QuakerPodcast.com/support, please do. It would mean a lot to us and to listeners like Becca. Thank you, and back to the show.
Welcome back. Before the break, the Friends of African Descent had just established the Ujima Friends Peace Center. In this half of the show, we're going to explore what that center has become and why worshiping as a Black Quaker community has been such an integral part of both Ujima's and Ayesha's journeys. Plus, we're going to talk a little bit about reparations.
We established worship, and then we started establishing some community-based programs. We did reach out to other organizations in the community, and I think our first major ministry was our food giveaway. When you add up the numbers of people in the families, it's more like 800, 900 people every other Saturday, and we bring together all kinds of volunteers, young people, older people. Like, it's just like real cool because we believe hunger is a form of violence. We started having renters' rights classes because eviction is a form of violence and it is perpetrated against Black women with children in similar ways that incarceration is perpetrated disproportionately on Black males.
Through this work, Ujima is building a community. At least that's the goal. One where the people in their neighborhood become part of Ujima's work instead of just its benefactors.
Even when we're doing our food giveaway, it really feels like a food share. And we have so many folks in the community now who were getting food in line who now just volunteer to help. And we have folks from the community. There's this elder in the community, and she probably is like 90, and she comes to the food giveaway. She said God sent her to the food giveaway to pray for us. So everything stops, and the elder prays. This elder, everybody, you Muslim, whatever you are, we just stand here and let this elder do her thing. And she does. And we pour libations, we have some silence, we do our thing. But like whatever we're doing, we really want to operate in the spirit of like, y'all, we got some food, let's share it. As opposed to we're here doing something for you. Like we all in it. We all in it together. And that's the spirit of Ujima.
We started our interview in the main room where the worship group meets. But now Ayesha leads me through to the back of the building where a lot of the action happens. We go down a few hallways and through some doors.
So this is where magic gets made. But
there's a room with chest freezers and refrigerators where the food is stored for the bi-monthly food donations. Nearby, metal shelvings house sewing machines and fabric and suitcases for PASHI, the Pan-African Sisterhood Health Initiative. This initiative is one of Ujima's partners in peace. They use the space to sew reusable menstrual pads and birthing kits that have been sent to women around the world, throughout the continent of Africa, in Cuba, and in other developing areas. The sewers gather every week and are teaching girls in the community to make them too.
They just make magic. So you have this group of Black women elders that now have expanded to these young people who they're teaching how to make reusable menstrual pads, right? Because of the period poverty that's going on, not only in Africa, but here.
There are sometimes 20, even 25 women working on this project, and sometimes they're joined by a dozen or so schoolgirls. Children are a big part of Ujima's work. They have a freedom school in the summer for middle schoolers, many of whom are of African descent and who attend Sankofa Charter School, where Ayesha is head of school. Last summer, they spent almost all of their time outside, including visits to the grounds of Friends meetings beyond Philly. Ayesha says that since COVID,
middle schoolers and teenagers, we've had such an uptick in cutting and, suicidal ideation and, just general depression. And so we decided to have a program that, first of all, we would unplug them. We're not going to do anything with any computers. Nobody's going to be on screen. And it's going to be all outdoors. And so instead of having it here, we said we would be in friendly spaces.
That's friendly with a capital F. Kids spent the summer sitting under trees, reading bell hooks, learning about social justice and their own emotional and mental well-being, and also about Quakerism. It's been good for the kids and good for the mostly white meetings that have opened their properties to the children. It also highlights the economic and racial disparities in Quakerism.
I'm grateful for folks that have supported this center. and the work that we're doing.
But Ayesha says that white Quakers can do more to rectify these racial disparities that are still so prevalent in Philadelphia and in the rest of the country.
How could Black Quakers be in a rented space? Oh, but you have meeting houses and land that you inherited from labor that, my ancestors provided in many cases, and unjust systems that allowed you to prosper while we could not. So let's have those conversations about how you make that right? So you have these Black students sitting under a tree, talking about the Black Quaker movement, but they see the contradictions. What you gonna do about that? I'm hoping that at some point that Quakers won't be like the rich young ruler that goes to Jesus and says, how can I have, this salvation, this? And he says, give everything you have. And he walked away sadly, right? Because he was too attached to those material things, right? So when people are wringing their hands about racism, I'm not that impressed with it.
So I want to circle back to worship because the Peace Center was built on Quaker worship. It was the first thing that the Friends of African Descent established when they got the building, before they even began welcoming kids and feeding the community. But I wondered, what is it that draws these Black friends to Quakerdom? After all, as Ayesha shares, Black Quakers have challenging experiences of racism among white Quakers. And honestly, if you look at the history, that's not new.
I don't imagine that there have been very many Black friends who have not encountered microaggressions, macroaggressions, been confronted with, racism and marginalization and all. Like, you can't be Black and Quaker and not have had those experiences. But you can't be Black in America and not have had those experiences. And I think that one of the differences is that many Black Quakers, in my experience hurt because they come into Quakerism expecting Quakers to be something other than white Americans.
So why is Quaker worship still part of the equation, and why does it resonate with this African American community?
I think there's this wonderful liberty of the spirit that is difficult to find in some other places. Being able to share spiritual community without sharing doctrine is a gift, right? And so there, particularly today amongst young people, there are people who, they love God. They would consider themselves spiritual, but they can't fit in to the dogma, the sexual morality rules, they just don't, the hierarchy, the patriarchy, there's some things that they want to be free from. And so there are Black people who are looking for spaces like that. This African-centered approach to Quakerism, I just feel like, why not? I think that's the beauty of Quakerism that I would want to share. Just creating safe spaces for Black people to be gay, lesbian, trans, just bring it. Bring it all right here, and we're going to respect one another, and I can listen to your ministry. And I think Quakerism, creating a space like this, provides that opportunity.
These friends have found in Quakerism a place where they feel they can worship freely. Yet, it seems this group also exists in part because they didn't always feel this liberty in white Quaker spaces, the freedom to express their spiritual identities and their cultures.
I think people are more comfortable referencing the spirit, referencing spiritual matters. And in unprogrammed meetings, more and more, people seem less and less comfortable with spiritual and religious language, right? And so there are lots of meetings where, like references to Jesus, people, kind of get freaked out because it's like, well, what about the Muslims here? And what about the Jews here? And I think amongst friends of African descent, like we got Rasta Quakers, we got Muslim Quakers, we got, Christian Quakers. It just doesn't bother us.
This is the group that built the Ujima Peace Center. Today, Ujima Friends Meeting is a separate entity from the Peace Center, something that happened during COVID when worship moved online. But the two are still closely tied together. Ayesha says that they are also still figuring out how their Quakerism and African heritage coalesce while not defining it in opposition or juxtaposition to white Quakers.
I'm very clear that I call myself a friend of African descent, right? Because for me, it's an affirming statement of what I am, as opposed to a person of color. For me, which puts white people at the center and says, there's white people and then there's everybody else. And so I just choose not to think of myself that way, to organize myself that way, and to give white people that much space in terms of my self-definition.
There's a lot for everyone to learn, and there will be culture clashes. And that's all right. Remember that red dress story from before? Well, Ayesha became friends with that fellow Quaker. And she says she's found that white Quakers often want to know how they can make spaces more diverse and welcoming. And that's something they'll have to do to thrive in the years ahead, she says.
I believe that the future of the Religious Society of Friends is dependent on what happens to friends of color, friends of African descent, poor friends, right? That if the Religious Society of Friends thinks it's going to really realize its full spiritual potential without this diversity, is sadly mistaken. So as I come into like the fullness of, the woman that God intended me to be, and I show up with who I am, and you show up with who you are, there are going to be some problems. And if we are all like really trying to live our lives based on the ethos of love, then it means that we're going to be willing to struggle with one another, right? And so that's what I'm here to do. I'm here for the struggle.
So how can Quakers respond? Well, Ayesha says they need to get serious about reparations.
At some point, Quakers need to figure out their ownership of land, and they need to give us some land to have this Peace Center on and build a space for our children. And they need to open some Quaker schools that poor children can go to, as opposed to 1 or 2 scholarships to their schools. If they want to work on that, I would appreciate that. And give me a call when they figure that out.
If you don't have any money, that's no problem. Friends have done meditation and art and music projects with the kids, and anyone is welcome to sew menstrual pads or create birthing kits.
Like, we welcome that kind of participation. So we welcome friends doing things with us. We just don't want them to organize busloads of white people. And don't come because you're curious. Come because the Spirit has sent you here, and you truly want to worship, and you really feel like you've been led to be a part of this ministry.
Thank you for listening, and thank you to our guest, Ayesha Imani. Find a link to the transcript, reflect on our discussion questions, and find more information about Ujima Friends Meeting and Ujima Friends Peace Center at QuakerPodcast.com. Today's episode was reported and produced by me, Georgia Sparling. Jon Watts wrote and performed the music. Studio D mixed the episode. And our moment of Quaker Zen was read by Grace Gonklevsky. And don't forget to listen to the end of the episode so you can hear all about that new segment. The Quaker Podcast is a part of The Quaker Project, a Quaker media organization whose focus is on lifting up voices of spiritual courage and giving Quakers a platform in 21st century media. If you want to support our work, please consider becoming a monthly supporter. Every contribution expands our capacity to tell Quaker stories in a fresh way, and it makes this project sustainable. Visit thequaker.org for more information. Okay, an announcement. As I teased earlier, we've got a new addition to the show, and I've got my colleague Maeve here to tell us all about it. But first, Maeve, would you tell everybody who you are?
Hi, I'm Maeve Sutherland. I'm the social media and newsletter coordinator for Thee Quaker.
Awesome, and we're so glad that you're on the team now. So yeah, tell us about this new segment. What is it called? What's it all about?
So at the end of your regularly scheduled podcast episode, we're going to have a moment of Quaker Zen, and that's going to be a quote from a Quaker thinker, visionary, and it's going to just give you something to hold as you carry on into your week until the next episode.
I'm really looking forward to these. And they're also part of a bigger project that you're working on. Would you tell us more about that?
Yeah, well, we're starting a daily Quaker devotional email. That's for people who want to start a daily spiritual practice, and it's going to be called the Daily Quaker Message. And it's going to have a quote, it'll have queries, it'll have things to try out in your own life to help with your spiritual growth.
And people can go ahead and sign up for that now.
Yes, they can, and I hope they do. It's going to be great.
So go to dailyquaker.com to join the mailing list. That's dailyquaker.com. Okay, here is our very first moment of Quaker Zen.
Thomas R. Kelly, 1966, The Eternal Promise. The Quaker discovery and message has always been that God still lives and moves, works and guides in vivid immediacy within the hearts of men. For revelation is not static and complete like a book, but dynamic and enlarging as springing from a life and soul of all things.